She left the apartment with a single sentence folded into the pocket of a suitcase. "You're a financial burden." The words hit the room like a slammed door, literal, then echoing. Lydia's heels clacked down the stairwell. The only sound left behind was the hollow rattle of a ring on the coffee table and the rustle of grocery bags settling into silence. Terrell sat very still, one hand on the wood where the ring had landed. The apartment smelled faintly of citrus and laundry detergent. The fridge hummed. Outside, a delivery truck muttered down the street. Inside, the moment was smaller than he'd expected. No shouting, no raised voices, just the clean, ordinary geometry of an emptied life. Keys, ring, a folded receipt Lydia had left on the counter. She had slid the receipt across the laminate like a verdict. He breathed in, let it out. The tightness in his chest was a quiet, businesslike thing, less pain than paperwork. He moved like a man trained to take precise actions in messy situations. He cleared the groceries into the sink. He set the keys where they lay, then went to his laptop. On the screen, 3 new lines of text sat like promises and threats. An email with the subject, "Final terms, acquisition scheduled in 72 hours. Another from a journalist, "Forbes interview, embargoed." A third, "Transfer confirmation, escrow funded." His calendar blinked. Day 3, press embargo lifts in 72 hours. He read them in order, as if the life that had been interrupted could be folded back into sequence. Terrell Hunter had built simple things by design, small, elegant software that understood people at a scale that had seemed impossible when he wrote the first lines of code in a coffee shop 3 years earlier. He had told his engineers to make clarity a feature. To him, simplicity was a discipline, not a lack. Lydia had never taken him for disciplined. She'd called his thriftiness plain. At parties, she favored men who arrived in brand-new suits and loud watches. She liked the appearance of upward mobility, the quick photograph, the narrative that fit on an ankle tattoo and a champagne flute. She had left behind a note scrawled on a napkin. "You don't get me, I'm done." The napkin fluttered on the table like a confession. Terrell folded it and slid it into a drawer with a patience he had learned in debugging long nights. Day 3, the calendar called again. If you root for the underdog, like this video and subscribe for more true-style comeback stories. He almost laughed at the absurdity of saying that into the void. He almost did something dramatic. Threw the keys in the trash, smashed the laptop. He did none of those things. He opened the escrow confirmation and read the wiring instructions. They were legally tidy. There was the acquiring company's name. Sterling Hayes' Umbrella, one of those conglomerates that sweeps up small, bright companies and gives them scale. Under terms, acquisition includes subsidiary equity allocations. Note, transfer of minority interest in regional partner, Crescent Bank, to be handled via holding vehicle. He blinked at Crescent Bank. The name was one he knew only because of Lydia. She'd taken a small personal line of credit 2 years earlier to launch a pop-up boutique, a weekend storefront, dresses she sold at consignment. Crescent had approved the credit after Lydia brought in a glossy business plan and the right references. Terrell had helped her with the spreadsheet and the application because he'd always been good with numbers. She had branded the store, smiled in photos, and promised they'd both share in whatever came. He remembered her at the kitchen table then. Hair in a messy bun, phone out, counting coins. "It's a start," she'd said. He'd nodded, because a start is often all you need. He had not imagined the start would be framed later as evidence of him being unambitious. To Lydia, his unwillingness to buy a larger apartment or to hand over his code for quick gains had been proof that he didn't want real life. Now the acquisition terms laid out an incidental consequence. Through the deal, his company would fold into Sterling Hayes' larger financial arm, which, through a series of permissible corporate acquisitions, held a controlling position in Crescent Bank. The documents were technical but not mystical. Terrell could see the line. Once the holding vehicle issued shares, a portion of them representing his equity would sit in a trust tied to the transaction. He would become a stakeholder in the holding entity. Legally, that could mean a slice, however small, of the bank's owners. The irony tasted almost bitter. Lydia had walked away calling him small. He would soon be connected, in the way contracts tie people, to the very bank that had given her the credit she used to buy clothes and launch the boutique that got her noticed. He felt the oddness of it, that someone who saw him as a burden, relied on an institution he'd in effect helped put into motion. But the documents made another thing very clear. Ownership on paper was not power in practice. He could not snap his fingers and yank credit lines. The law and corporate governance protected the bank from the whims of any newly joined junior shareholder. If he wanted anything other than his name on a stock certificate, he'd need a board seat and months of maneuvering, public filings, regulatory approvals, and a defensible strategy. The idea of using the bank as a cudgel felt not only impractical, but obscene. Terrell was not the sort for petty cruelty. He had not built an AI to punish people. He closed the laptop and sat a long time in the evening light, listening to the fridge in the city. He could have called Lydia. He could have asked for the other half of the rental payment that she'd so calmly never mentioned. He could have stormed over to Grant Westfield's office, the man he'd seen in Lydia's Instagram feed 2 nights ago, smiling with a corporate smile that read as much as it entertained. Grant's hand in Lydia's photos had rested lightly on her back, an investor's palm in a lover's pose. Screens cultivated an intimacy that sometimes matched reality and sometimes exaggerated it. The first shock was private, the second, practical. When he checked the server logs at 2 in the morning, an old habit, Terrell saw that a file had been flagged by their monitoring system. It was nothing obvious. A few lines of code, a test dataset, a screenshot saved to a shared drive, then an outbound email. The email sender was Lydia. Something was off about the timestamp. The message had been sent from outside their network, a home IP matching Lydia's phone plan. It wasn't damning. People forwarded things all the time. But that same night had a flurry of access attempts coming from an address associated with Westfield's firm. Attempts that matched Terrell's architecture. Attempts to query client metadata and model weights. Someone was poking at the walls. He printed the logs. They smeared slightly where his thumb had left a sweat mark. He copied them into a folder labeled Evidence. His hands were steady. The next morning, Lydia had posted a picture at a restaurant with Grant in front of a plate of oysters. The caption was tame, celebrating new directions, and comments had hearts and fire emojis. It was the kind of post people made when they wanted the world to read a clean, aspirational script. It didn't show the late-night messages he'd intercepted, or the tiny wire transfers from Grant's corporate card into Lydia's personal account that appeared as consulting fees on her statements. Those were small and defensible on the face of it. But the pattern, the timelines, the overlapping windows of access began to make a shape. Terrell did what he had always done. He cataloged. He printed bank statements, emails, screenshots of social posts. He sorted them like a shoebox of receipts that could prove a life. The narrative they built looked less like a clean betrayal and more like a slow, compounding series of poor choices and easier ways out. Lydia choosing the bright light of Genoa parties over the long darkness of patient building, Grant using charm to open doors he had no right to. He did not want to be cruel about her. It would have been easy to assemble a montage of her mistakes and submit it to his entire contact list. He did not. He copied the folder to a secure drive and called David. David was precise in the way that made Terrell grateful. "Don't do anything rash," David said into the phone, voice low and direct. "Send me everything. Don't delete anything. If there are access logs from your servers, preserve the originals. We can file a protective order if there's a risk." "She's not even on the company payroll," Terrell said. "She never had access, not formally." "Informal access can be just as damaging if she's forwarding files," David said. "Also tell me about the acquisition papers. There are disclosure rules in these transactions. Let's see if there's anything that links the company's IP to other entities in a way that could create conflicts." He paused. "And if you suspect corporate espionage, federal agencies can get involved. I can make a call to someone who knows the procedure." Terrell typed as David spoke, fingers precise. He saved a clean copy of every log and sent it to David with a short note. "Preserve, advise, do not publish." David's reply came before lunch. "Let's move carefully. Preserve chain of custody. I have a contact at a firm that can handle emergency filings if needed. And, very important, don't do anything that looks like retaliation. The law doesn't admire vigilantes. He had expected that caution. Terrell liked rules. Rules made messy things legible. Day 2. The calendar offered a smaller number. When Sandra Westfield slid into his inbox late that afternoon, the sender name startled him into remembering the last name. Sandra Westfield had liked a photo of Lydia's in passing on social media several months ago. Her profile was private. Her message was short and coded. "We need to talk." She included a mobile, a time, and the word urgent. He met Sandra at a coffee shop 2 blocks away from a building where, conveniently, Grant Westfield's firm kept a corner office. Sandra was not the glossy type in the photographs that accompanied executive profiles. She wore a practical coat and held an envelope that looked too thick for anything but paper. Her eyes were tired in a way that made Terrell feel suddenly less like a protagonist and more like a recipient of bad news in a slow economy. "I married the wrong kind of ambition," she said quietly, before she offered him whatever small pleasure comes from the symmetry of 2 broken people sitting across from each other. She set the envelope on the table. "He does what he does so he can look better at galas. He collects people. I kept thinking it would stop." Her voice held the cautious irony of someone who had learned to speak in clauses. Inside the envelope was a stack of photographs. Dinners, a hotel lobby with a tray bill, screenshots of messages where Grant asked for a sample flow, and Lydia's replies saying she would look into it. There were also audio snippets. A voice, Grant's, on a phone call saying, "We need the consumer appetite data, the segmentation matrix. Even a hint will help our RFP win." And an email, forwarded, with clauses that matched Terrell's own NDAs. Sandra's hands trembled when she slid a flash drive across to him. "I recorded him once," she said. "I didn't plan to. I just wanted proof for myself. But then I started collecting things. He's not faithful to me. He was never faithful to me. He takes things. He uses them." "You could go to the board," Terrell said, perhaps because the calmest thing he could imagine was a boardroom where people looked shocked in slow motion and did the right thing. "I tried," Sandra said. "He knows people. He knows how to make a problem look like an accident. I couldn't risk everything on whispers." She looked at him earnest. "I don't want to ruin your life. I want him stopped. I think Lydia doesn't know what she handed him, or maybe she does. I don't know. I thought you should have this." Terrell put the drive into his pocket without looking as if he were being given contraband, though perhaps it was. He had no intention of breaking laws. He had intention enough, and maybe that would be dangerous enough. Day 2 slid toward evening like a long, deliberate breath. He called Sterling Hayes's liaison. He needed to know whether advancing the announcement was possible. The acquiring company had been firm for months about the embargo. The press timeline had been locked with corporate lawyers and a PR agency. Changing it at 48 hours was awkward but not unheard of, especially in the face of potential leaks. Sterling's liaison, a woman named Marianne, heard him with the kind of polite attention executives have when they decide whether a man has a sound argument or an emotional plea. "We arranged all travel and interviews based on the embargo," she said. "But if there's a legal concern, we can open the paperwork. We'll need counsel on both sides to sign off." "There's a better reason," Terrell said. He did not want to tell her about Lydia's social media or the photos in Sandra's envelope yet. He wanted to preserve leverage without making motion pictures out of people. "We have a potential compromise of our systems. I don't want this to become a story that looks like negligence." "Protect the IP then," Marianne said. "We don't want the narrative distracted. Send us the logs. We can ask our compliance team to expedite." He sent the logs. He sent a redacted folder to David. He placed a call to Morgan Vale at Forbes. 10 seconds of preamble, then a straightforward ask. "The interview is scheduled. There's an embargo." He offered a guarded sense of the story. A founder who built a modest company into something larger, who believed the public deserved to know the technology and the people behind it. Morgan's reply was careful, the kind of curiosity that doesn't yet declare allegiance. "Send me the materials. We will hold until the embargo lifts," she said. Then added, almost as an aside, This sounds like a classic underdog story. I like that. He thought later how strange it would be for the world to celebrate him while his marriage collapsed in another room. For some people, success is a kind of spotlight that clarifies everything. For others, it magnifies fissures. Day 2 concluded with a row of small, correlated actions. David sending back a list of filings to make if things escalated. Marianne confirming receipt of the logs and scheduling a compliance review. Sandra texting him to say she'd be available to meet investigators if it came to that. Lydia posting a photograph with Grant in a lobby that suggested future plans and a life she was already packaging. Terrell slept in small increments. In his head, he rewound the timeline and studied it like a map. There were moments that looked like crossroads only in retrospect. The night Lydia had brought home the first stacks of fabric samples. The night she had laughed with guests about marrying into something that sparks, and his dry private smile. He thought about the goodness of small habits, the way he paid rent on time, the way he debugged code while Luna, their cat, slept on his notebooks. Those habits had been the scaffolding for a business that might now get him a kind of shelter he'd never imagined asking for. He woke on day 1 with a plan. Agencies, counsel, PR, everything had a place now. He needed trust and speed. He needed to avoid drama and preserve integrity. He sat at his kitchen table, opened an email addressed to Sterling Hayes with the subject, "Request to advance announcement, urgent security concern." He wrote in the plain, calm way he used in code comments and client emails. He attached the logs in a clear statement. "We have evidence of unauthorized external access attempts that coincided with outbound communications involving a personal contact. We request immediate compliance review and permission to release a revised statement should authorities require public disclosure before the embargo." He hit send and felt something loosen. A decision is, in its way, a small relief. When you decide, you choose a future over stasis. For Terrell, it was not catharsis. It was the start of work. The rest of the morning moved like a sequence in a film where everyone is a step ahead of the next scene. An email from Marianne came back within an hour. "We'll convene legal within 2 hours." David suggested language and asked whether Terrell wanted to file a temporary restraining order to seal the drives. Terrell declined. "We protect the IP," he wrote back. "We do not trap people." He went to the rooftop of his building for air. The city looked like a set of folded maps, neighborhoods bookmarked by construction cranes and the occasional green for a park. He thought about how small gestures accrue into reputations. He thought about Lydia's incisive wardrobe, the way she always layered textures until a fabric became a statement. He thought about Grant, who wore predatory charm like an accessory, and wondered about the mechanics of appetite, why some people collected trophies and others built steady things. On his phone, an incoming message from an unknown number. "Are you Terrell Hunter?" "Sandra." He smiled wearily. There was a knock on the door soon after. He opened it to find Agent Martinez, not in a suit but with the formal ease of someone who had a badge in a pocket and procedure in their head. "I don't want to alarm you," Agent Martinez said, then smiled with the practiced calm of those who knew how to ease fear into cooperation. "We've had a call to our cybercrimes unit about potential unauthorized access in acquisitions and fintech. I just need to ask you a few questions." Her questions were bureaucratic yet precise. When were the access attempts logged? Who had credentials? Were their known passwords shared? And did Terrell have reason to believe an external party had solicited the data? Terrell explained. He told her about social posts, about the server logs, about the forwarded files. He never said anything that presumed guilt. He stuck to facts and timestamps. She took notes. She asked about Sandra. He told her about the envelope. She requested the flash drive as potential evidence and explained chain of custody. Terrell felt in that moment peculiarly relieved to hand over something that could be scrutinized by people whose job it was to make things legible. The alternative, foggy internet accusation, felt worse. "Don't let this shape your public statement yet," Agent Martinez advised as she left. "If the investigation opens, you may be asked to preserve everything. But don't conduct a public attack on anyone. We need to establish motive and access responsibly. He nodded. The agent's parting words were a reminder that his life had shifted into a zone where public and private overlapped, and where the ethical move was often the most effective. Day 1 narrowed. The countdown now felt like a physical drumbeat in his chest. 24 hours until the embargo lifts, 24 hours until journalists start trawling more aggressively, 24 hours until Morgan Vale might write a leady about the small founder who built an intelligent model that finally matched human nuance. It was a compact, crowded day, not with spectacle but with the steady work of aligning processes. Legal on standby, PR ready to pivot, compliance examining the contracts. He met with Sterling's compliance team in a glass conference room where sunlight cast clean, corporate lines across his hands. Sterling Hayes himself did not attend. Instead, a senior executive with an elderly sound voice said, "We appreciate your diligence." Marianne sat to his right, efficient and composed. The conversation was polite and technical. They asked for the logs. Terrell gave them everything, but he left out the impulse to comment on Lydia's motives. He had no appetite, he thought with a certain pride, to weaponize private grief for PR gains. Outside the conference room, a string of notifications began to seep into his phone like rain through a window. Morgan Vale confirmed she would hold the piece under embargo, but wanted to schedule a brief follow-up. Sandra texted, "Thank you. Be careful." Grant texted nothing. Grant never needed to text when he could measure the room with a look and the tilt of a glass. Lydia called once. No message. Terrell did not answer. He walked back to his apartment, through the same doorway where the ring had landed 2 mornings earlier, and he sat at the kitchen table. He opened the flash drive Sandra had given him and copied its contents to a secure drive. The files were messy, human. A voicemail from Sandra to a friend complaining about Grant's pattern of behavior. A recording of Grant saying, "We're not stealing, just aggregating what's publicly available," which read like legalese thinly veiled. Photographs of meetings. A file named LydiaNotes.docs, containing a shopping list and a line about client segmentation doc, forward if needed. The human element sat beside the calculated ones. Terrell felt a weight that was not lightened by the coming press. The irony of him owning the bank she borrowed from brushed past his anger and landed on a softer spot. That people were complicated and making mistakes sometimes looked like betrayal. He remembered the first night of code, the simplicity of creating something that did exactly what you told it to do. He had wanted to build a thing that made lives quieter, that rewarded patient work. If the world now wanted to reward him with recognition, he would accept it, but not as an instrument against someone else. He prepared the redacted folder for Morgan Vale, including a statement about their technology in plain terms, an AI that mapped emotional intent, a model that could read context and scale it without losing human nuance. He wrote of the team, small, disciplined, good. He attached no pictures of Lydia, no photos of Grant. He chose restraint. On the kitchen counter, the ring still glinted. The apartment had an after-image to it. The napkin, the groceries, the quiet that followed someone leaving. Terrell stacked the evidence folder, closed his laptop, and went to the living room to make tea. The kettle hissed like a patient animal. He poured himself a cup and drank it without thinking. Day 1 ended with a message from Sterling's counsel. "We will consider advancing the announcement if the compliance review concludes there is a risk to IP and the PR team approves. We will coordinate with you." There was a small signature block and a corporate logo, nothing triumphant, nothing punitive, just a schedule. He put his mug down and, without conscious planning, opened a blank note and began to write a list of things to do once the acquisition closed and the dust had settled. Commit to mentorship programs, set up a fund for early-stage founders from overlooked neighborhoods, offer a scholarship for women in tech. It was the first time he allowed himself a little future beyond the immediate puzzle. He wrote the items simply, as if scrawling them into a ledger would be enough to make them true. The clock on his phone ticked toward midnight. He checked the countdown again. The number was smaller now. Less than 12 hours until the embargo. His phone vibrated. It was Lydia, finally, a message. "We need to talk." He read it and did not reply. He put the phone face down and went to the window. The city lights were discreet and scattered. He thought of all the small things that accumulate into a life: librarian habits, paying bills on time, teaching a younger engineer to find an edge case before it became a bug. He thought how easily those things are invisible until someone needs proof. He slept badly, fingers restless. He dreamed of a bank building with glass steps that kept folding into themselves. In the mornings of his life, he preferred simple architectures, predictable load-bearing walls. The dream had shades of too many unknowns: legal approvals, regulatory fences, headlines. He woke more tired than before. The next morning they called it day 0. He arrived at the office early. Engineers moved in and out with a kind of quiet intensity. The team had known the stakes in the abstract and had rallied without the drama. They checked systems, audited logs, restored point-in-time backups. They closed doors and tightened permissions. Terrell walked through the office, saying small, precise things that steadied people without preaching. He signed his name on the final non-disclosure and a simple note to the team: keep building the right thing. Then Morgan Vale arrived for the interview. She was a professional of the kind that asks probing questions and takes the answers as data. Her recorder sat on the table, innocuous. The interview was careful and humane. Morgan wanted to know how he thought about risk, how he explained complexity simply, what failure felt like. Terrell answered with the same steady clarity he used on his code comments. He talked about intention and the slow discipline of iteration. He did not talk about Lydia. After the interview, as they walked toward the elevator, Morgan said, "People love a redemption arc." She tilted her head, letting him know the shape of narrative she envisioned. They love to see someone small become something bigger. Terrell looked at her a moment. "I guess I'm less interested in becoming bigger than in being useful," he said. "I like simplicity because it's reliable." Morgan smiled in a way that wasn't judgmental. "That's the hook," she said. "The small, stubborn truth." He felt something like a tide under the surface. Press would come, the acquisition would be announced, and the world would choose its line in the story. He could not control what people read into the headlines. He could, he told himself, control his own actions. The embargo lifted at noon. For 3 days he'd been moving in a tight, purposeful arc: legal preservation, evidence collection, conversations with compliance, careful restraint. The world outside his apartment, which had felt indifferent and loud, now had a focus: an underdog's company joining a conglomerate, an AI that could read human nuance. Headlines would make him larger. That was the natural pattern. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and watched the news cycle start to roll. There would be congratulations and op-eds. There would be people who had only now heard the name Terrell Hunter and decided he was a type. He found he had less appetite for spectacle than he expected. At noon he also received a text from Sandra. They took the drive. Agent Martinez called. "It looks like they will look into the traffic from the IP tied to Westfield's firm. I hope, for whatever that's worth, that someone finally stops him from doing this to more people." Terrell folded the napkin Lydia had left and set it in the folder with the evidence. He thought about the bank line in the acquisition documents and the absurd poetry of the situation. She had called him small. He would now be, in a minor, technical way, connected to the bank that had given her the means to leave. It would make a tidy headline: "My wife divorced me for being too simple, unaware I owned the bank she borrowed from." He let the phrasing sit with him, because headlines are a kind of condensation. They take whole lives and compress them into one jagged sentence. It was tempting to enjoy the irony. He did not. Instead, he thought about the work ahead. The legal filings, the compliance reviews, the mentoring he'd promised himself. He thought about how he would measure success now, by the small scaffolding he could leave behind for other people, not by the loudness of a headline. He walked to the window again and, for once, let the silence fill him without the urge to fix it. Outside, a delivery driver hoisted a box into a car. A child laughed somewhere down the block. The city never paused for anyone. He picked up his phone and paused at Lydia's message, then rolled it away. He had chosen a different kind of dignity, to let events run on their course while keeping his hands clean. He placed the evidence folder on the shelf beside the napkin and went to his desk to draft a short email to Marcus Williams, a young founder he'd been mentoring since he met him at a regional hackathon. If the worst of the headlines made him a curiosity, he wanted to use that curiosity to lift others. His fingers moved over the keys. He wrote a brief note. "Proud of the work you're doing. Let's talk next week about scaling with integrity." He pressed send. Outside, the clock moved toward the moment the world would know his name. Inside, the quiet work of repair and planning continued. He had made choices in private. Now the public would arrive to interpret them. He would not let the moment consume him. He would let it be a tool, nothing more. An instrument with which to build something larger and more deliberate than the easy gratifications that had taken Lydia away. He closed his laptop, stood, and turned off the apartment lights. The ring still sat where she had left it, small and bright in the dark. He did not move it. He walked to the door, then paused, feeling the gravity of the next hours press against his ribs. He thought about how many things could happen in a day. He thought about how some revolutions happen on small scales, in servers and meeting rooms, and the careful folding of evidence into neat stacks. A knock came at the door, precise, at the hour when the embargo would lift in minutes. He opened it a crack. A courier held an envelope with the Forbes crest. Inside was a proof of the cover layout, his face modest in black and white above a line that promised more than it could possibly deliver. He let out a breath and smiled, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who knows his life is not yet a story, but will soon be read as one. He set the envelope on the counter, the napkin beside it, the evidence folder within reach. The countdown had done its work, ushered him from private grief to public presence in a way that would reveal far more than he'd planned. He touched the corner of the napkin, and for the first time since Lydia's footsteps faded down the stair, allowed himself to feel both the ache and the shape of his resolve. Outside, the world stirred. Inside, he prepared to meet it. The clock struck noon, and like a well-timed cue, the inbox around him began to move. Notifications unspooled. The Forbes piece published, aggregator tweets, a pulse of congratulations from strangers and acquaintances, a few investors asking for follow-ups. The headline cut clean. Terrell Hunter, the founder who taught machines to read people. His face, in muted black and white, sat above a paragraph that liked the simplicity he favored and turned it into narrative. He let the messages come, and, as he'd done since day 3 began, he watched but did not chase. His phone filled with the polite congratulations of people whose names he recognized only in transactions. Angel investors, a university contact, a reporter wanting another comment. The applause felt both surreal and inadequate. It was a sound distance away from the place where Lydia's receipt lay and where the ring still glinted. Agent Martinez called almost immediately after the public piece circulated. Her voice was steady. "We have probable cause to execute a warrant at Westfield's firm," she said. "We need to move quickly. Sandra has cooperated. Your evidence helped corroborate the patterns we're seeing." "Do what you need," Terrell said, saying it felt like loosening a knot. He handed over whatever else the agent requested, timestamps, server snapshots, Sandra's flash drive. He didn't ask for theater. He wanted procedure, warrants, affidavits, properly sworn statements. The law, he had learned, preferred paper and dates to vengeance. Meanwhile, social feeds flared. Comment sections divided neatly between celebrants and skeptics. A few pieces wondered why a modest founder had turned into a media moment so quickly. The human appetite for a tidy story, underdog, exile, resurgence, did its usual work. He recognized that hunger, but he refused to tailor his life to satisfy it. Around 1 in the afternoon, Terrell watched streamed footage that felt unreal. Uniformed agents arriving at a chrome-paneled building downtown, suits frozen as doors were opened, a man led out in handcuffs while passers-by filmed on phones. Grant Westfield's arrest was orderly and documentary straight. He shouted his legal counsel's name, framed the scene with indignation, and in the background a clerk closed a folder with an air that implied no one was above process. There were no dramatic takedowns, no cinematic violence, just protocol and a stream of neutral statements. Arrested on charges of corporate espionage and obstruction, investigation ongoing. Neutrality, he thought, was a mercy. Terrell had expected the arrest. He had not expected the odd little guilt that rose when he watched someone he had seen in social photos moved from executive ease to a man in a detention room. This was not satisfaction. It was the recognition that human lives bend under legal force, and that force should be applied sparingly and justly. He returned to the apartment and made tea, the kettle's hiss, the same small domestic sound it had been 3 days earlier. Lydia's downfall unfolded more subtly. She did not get a Twitter mob or a public shaming in the way pop culture's hunger imagined. She got severed contracts, a terse HR email from Lux Marketing Solutions noting a violation of company ethics policies, and a text from a boutique partner ending collaboration, effective immediately. Friends stopped tagging her enthusiastically in posts. The boutique's suppliers paused shipments until audits were completed. The boutique's glamorous Instagram feed blurred overnight into square images with fewer likes. She texted him once, 3 hours after Grant's arrest, a message that wasn't a plea and wasn't an accusation. "We need to talk. This is a mess." He read it and felt briefly the old reflex to answer the phone. He had written a list of things to do after the acquisition closed: charity ideas, mentorship, scholarships, but never a line that said how to respond to people who had hurt him. David's voice returned in his head. "Don't do anything that looks like retaliation. The law does not admire vigilantes." He set his phone down and went to work. The day blurred into the next, when legal filings began in earnest. David instructed him to file for divorce on grounds of abandonment and to invoke the prenuptial agreement they'd signed years prior. Clean, contained, drafted by careful hands. The paperwork was functional, not performative. Terrell signed, as he had signed code, with the expectation that neat documentation made messy things manageable. There was nothing cathartic in the courthouse, just pens that clicked and a clerk who asked him the same routine questions 100 times a month. David negotiated the protective language that ensured the private terms of the settlement would be respected. Terrell wanted clarity, not spectacle. Sandra's cooperation with Agent Martinez proved decisive. She gave sworn statements and handed over material evidence, calendars, receipts, recordings. She agreed to sit for an interview that would later be summarized in a neutral press release. Her courage was simple, an accumulation of quiet acts that had finally become a public good. Terrell met with her again, this time not in a coffee shop, but at a windowed conference room where they sat across from an FBI agent and a corporate investigator. Sandra's hands were steadier than the last time. Someone had placed her on a path that asked for facts and rewarded truth. "I didn't want to ruin anyone's life," she told Terrell between pauses, her voice small and unvarnished. "I wanted to stop him from doing it again." "You did the right thing," he said. The words felt insufficient but honest. He did not offer absolution for Lydia's choices. He only acknowledged what had been done. Lydia's trajectory after the arrests was not meteoric in public terms. She faded into the background story of someone whose choices had consequences. She attempted to return to the boutique a week after Grant's arrest and found closed doors. Suppliers were unwilling to risk association. A partner she had courted for a regional pop-up declined to renew their agreement. The boutique's landlord accepted early termination of the lease amid a flurry of paperwork. She lost not because a crowd demanded it, but because the network of commerce, cautious and rational, withdrew its trust. There were smaller, quieter ripples, too. People she had known socially stopped inviting her to events. A few acquaintances texted pointed messages asking if everything was okay, an oblique kind of social policing. She tried to call Terrell an improbable number of times. Each call went unanswered. Private messages piled at the bottom of screens. Without public humiliation, her world narrowed into practical consequences that demanded accounting. In interviews that followed the Forbes piece, Terrell deflected. He spoke about the technology and the team's ethics, about the design principle of simplicity and how it had guided them. He refused to let the conversation become a prosecutorial inquiry into private lives. "I've always believed that clarity is a sign of respect," he told a TV reporter. "Clarity in product, clarity in contracts, clarity in how we treat one another." Sterling Hayes's PR team worked to ensure the acquisitions narrative remained centered on product and people rather than scandal. In integration meetings, Terrell pushed for clauses that he knew would matter: commitments to data privacy, an independent oversight board for ethical product use, funding earmarked for programs aimed at underrepresented founders. He had leverage, enough to ask that the holding vehicle's minority stakes tied to the Crescent Bank allocation be treated transparently, and that no single new shareholder could wield that interest to influence day-to-day banking decisions without regulatory process. It was a small, principled step to prevent the acquisition from being read as some reckless transfer of financial power. In public, the irony of owning the bank she borrowed from made a tidy line for headlines and late-night jokes. He saw the phrase repeated, sometimes with malice, sometimes with awe. The reality, as he made clear in a carefully worded op-ed he declined to title sensationally, was more nuanced. The acquisition's corporate architecture created legal ties that were not the same as control. Ownership on paper is not the same as control in practice. Regulation, governance, and ethics complicate any simple narrative. He did not want to be a caricature in someone else's column. Grant's legal defense went through the motions of outrage and denial. His legal team insisted on counter-narratives: aggressive acquisition practices, misinterpretations of business conversations, a blurring of public and private life. The federal case unfolded in forensic detail, server logs parsed, patterns of access examined, the question of motive interrogated. For Terrell, the legal process was not theater. He had no appetite for vengeance, only for a system that rendered facts legible. The investigation moved forward with the patient, procedural tempo of institutions. As the dust settled, Terrell returned to the parts of his life that felt steady and honest, the small rituals that had lifted him through long nights of debugging and sleepless sprints. He met with Marcus in a coffee shop a few weeks after the acquisition closed. Marcus had the palimpsest of a person who split his time between hope and urgency: startup sketches, an instinct for product-market fit, an uncertain bank account. Terrell listened as Marcus spoke of the friction of raising funds, of being underestimated at pitches because his clothes didn't carry the right logo. "You don't need someone to make you visible," Terrell said, stirring his coffee. "You need someone who will see your work and help you make it legible to others." Marcus's eyes were bright with the combination of hunger and relief that mentorship can trigger. "Can you help us get a pilot?" he asked. "I can," Terrell said. "But the pilot needs to prove value, not just promise it. Bring your deck, bring the data, we'll test it." He opened a small envelope he had been given by Sterling's HR team after integration, a letter confirming a commitment to a mentorship fund and an internship pipeline for founders like Marcus, prioritized by neighborhood and need. It was modest: seed money, office desk for 3 months, but it meant something to both of them. Terrell signed off on a program proposal that would put Marcus and 2 other founders into a structured track: mentorship, technical support, and access to a tiny capital pool. It was direct and not theatrical. The work of changing ecosystems, he believed, happened in many small places. Months later, Terrell stood at a low-key regional summit to deliver a keynote that had become a small talk in the circles he now moved through. The venue was neither massive nor ostentatious: a university auditorium with folding chairs and a modest stage. Marcus sat near the front, notebook open. Dr. Alicia Johnson, the ethics researcher he'd been collaborating with on privacy and empathetic machine interfaces, sat in the second row. She had been part of the advisory board he'd insisted on creating and had pushed for the independent oversight model he had fought for during integration talks. Her presence in the audience felt like an anchor. He spoke not of headlines, but of habit. He spoke about making products that defer to human dignity, about the habit of documenting decisions, about the invisible scaffolding that lets a person carry a life. He told the room a version of the story that skipped the salacious parts and focused on the practices that had held him together: paying people on time, defining success by constancy rather than applause, and carving out time to teach others how to read logs and avoid common mistakes when architecting systems. When Marcus asked a question about fundraising afterwards, Terrell answered with the same precision he used at the kitchen table. He did not preach, he offered tactics born of experience: the value of clean data, the value of good user research, and the ethical obligations that make partnerships sustainable. A few investors in the crowd approached afterward with interest in Marcus's pilot. One offered a small check to underwrite the next phase. It wasn't a windfall. It was practical help. The press kept asking about Lydia. He tried to answer with compassion. "People make choices for reasons I won't pretend to fully know," he told one interviewer. "Consequences follow choices. I don't want to be cruel, I want to be constructive." Lydia, for her part, found herself on a narrower, quieter path. The boutique closed. She took a temp job arranging displays at a small department store, work that required skill and gave immediate tactile satisfaction. It was far from the glamorous life she'd packaged online, but it was honest labor and it came with steady pay and fewer alarms. When the noise of the scandal finally ebbed, she applied to a local certificate program in small business management and, in a gesture that was small and deliberate, began to take night classes. She messaged Terrell once to say she had enrolled. He replied with a single line, "Good luck, take care of yourself." It was not forgiveness or an invitation. It was a boundary that left room for dignity on both sides. In the months that followed, Terrell used the acquisitions spotlight to set up something that mattered to him more than the optics of victory. A small fund named for the neighborhoods where he'd first learned to code. The fund provided microgrants and mentorship to founders who lacked the typical signals that attract venture capital. He appointed Dr. Alicia Johnson to an advisory role to ensure the fund's governance prioritized ethical scrutiny and accountability. Marcus and two other protégés received the program's inaugural support, which meant office space, technical mentorship, and a small stipend to build prototypes. The Crescent Bank connection, which had once felt like neat irony in headlines, required no further theatrical use. Terrell made a choice early in the acquisition negotiations, to recuse himself from any discussions about lending policy that would affect people he knew. He insisted, publicly and in filings, that whatever minority interest existed be subject to independent governance and that any bank-related decisions be made through appropriate regulatory channels. He placed his faith in institutions over impulse. He also created an internal policy at his now expanded company. If a founder or employee had a personal tie to a financial institution, they should disclose it and step back from decision-making that could create conflicts. The goal was not to sanitize human life out of business, but to render it legible, to prevent the easy confusions that turn someone else's life into a tool. In doing so, he avoided the temptation to turn the Crescent Bank line into performance. Ownership on paper remained an awkward, technical fact that did not translate into a personal instrument. Grant's trial, when it came to court, moved along the institutional grooves that make such things functional and slow. There were pre-trial motions, filings, arguments over admissibility of evidence. Terrell was deposed once, and he answered solemnly, dates, logs, and what he had seen. He refused, with the same quiet discipline he used for everything, to be drawn into speculation about motives beyond what the record showed. Legal processes are built to sort facts from stories, and he trusted that work even if it did not always wrap the world in the tidy justice that drama promised. Through that tense season, Dr. Alicia became more than an advisory partner. They worked late on a white paper defining practical guardrails for empathetic systems and responsible AI deployment, concrete suggestions for companies and regulators that, if followed, would reduce the chance of exploitation through misapplied data. Their collaboration was professional at first, and then, over many small shared coffees and long discussions about philosophy and code, quietly companionable. Neither moved quickly. Both moved steadily, preferring clarity and consent to headlines and hurry. The Forbes cover kept circulating, but by then it functioned more as a doorway than a destination. It opened opportunities, speaking invitations, offers to sit on advisory boards. A few offers from philanthropic organizations asking him to consult on programs to encourage tech entry points for underrepresented groups. He accepted selectively. Each engagement had to fit the policies he'd written, or he'd decline. Months later, he stood on a different stage to receive an award honoring small company founders who had demonstrated ethical leadership. He accepted, thanked his team, and, more importantly, announced a program to underwrite 3 years of funding for startups from neglected neighborhoods. He spoke about the power of consistent work rather than the seduction of overnight visibility. The work that matters, he said, is the work that accumulates when no one is watching. The award ceremony was not a closure. It was an inflection. Grant's court proceedings would be decided through solemn legal channels. Lydia's life would keep moving forward without him. Sandra's cooperation would mean fewer predatory behaviors for the people she had described. For Terrell, the narrative had changed from something personal and naked to something institutional and enduring. He kept his old rituals. He still made tea in the same kettle, sat on rooftops sometimes to look at the city's folded maps, and taught younger engineers to write comments that future colleagues could understand. He wrote the occasional note to Marcus and read drafts of his friends' pitches. He hired a small, diverse team and insisted on a company culture where hourly workers could bring concerns and be heard. The company he had built and chosen to fold into a larger one retained a fingerprint of the values he'd always insisted on: clarity over flash, ethics over easy wins. Occasionally, friends asked him if he felt vindicated. He considered the question with a quietness that was no less intense for being unperformative. "Vindication is a poor reason to do good work," he said to one friend over dinner. "It often arrives on its own without our instruction. The better question is whether your work helped someone." There were banal human moments that kept him grounded. He ran into Lydia once at a suburban bus stop. She stepped off a different bus at the same time as he did, both of them carrying grocery bags. Their eyes met long enough to register recognition and nothing else. She gave him a small nod. He nodded back. No words were necessary. The nod contained pity and apology, and the recognition that two lives had diverged. He thought often of the napkin on his shelf. It remained there, folded into the evidence folder, a relic of a moment that had been hurtful and necessary. He did not burn it or display it. He left it as a marker of what had been and what had been built since. Years later, at a small conference for social impact entrepreneurs, a young founder stood up during a Q&A and asked how to navigate personal crises while building a company. He told them the same thing he'd told Marcus: get good counsel, document your work, build structures that make your values habitual, and when you can, use your platform to lift others. The room listened like people who had been tired and were learning to be not so tired anymore. Terrell's life did not vend itself into a tidy moral tale. He continued to make mistakes, to learn, to find new edges where ethics and product met. He sometimes missed the intimacy of a different family life, and he thought of Lydia as someone who had once been part of that architecture. There was no applause for private regret, only the slow repair that comes from living according to the small principles you can control. On a late spring morning, he delivered a short address to the program he'd seeded for neighborhood founders. Marcus, now further along with a modest but promising prototype, stood in the crowd, and Dr. Alicia sat in the front row. He spoke about the quiet work of building and the strange gifts of being underestimated, how it taught you to make things that last. He closed the talk not with a flourish but with a simple invitation. "If you've ever been underestimated," he said, scanning the room casually, "I want you to remember two things. First, your work matters even if it isn't applauded yet. And second, if you make it through, pay that forward. Help the next person who can't be seen." People clapped, a modest, warm sound. Afterwards, a few attendees approached him with stories of their own: a mother who coded between shifts, a veteran rebuilding a life, a student who had hacked together a prototype in a dorm. He listened, offered practical advice, and connected them to the fund's intake process. In quieter hours, he sometimes thought about the headline that had tempted him, the one that simplified with a sharpness he'd never intended: "My wife divorced me for being too simple, unaware I owned the bank she borrowed from." The line had been clever, and it stung because it contained truth and absurdity in equal measure. He did not resent that the world liked irony. He resented only the idea that a person's worth could ever be summarized by a pun. He had learned, in the slow calculus of months and meetings and small decisions, that dignity was not a prize awarded by public opinion. It was a set of practices: to tell the truth when asked, to set boundaries that kept people safe, to build institutions that outlast your headlines, and to mentor the people who need scaffolding to rise. The company he helped steer after the acquisition carried those practices into its policies. Employees who had been overlooked now had access to training funds. A small legal clinic the company funded provided counsel to founders who could not otherwise afford it. These were not acts of grandeur. They were units of habit. Sometimes, late at night, he paged through old emails, first pitches, small thank you notes from early adopters, and a thread where Lydia had once written an enthusiastic plan for a pop-up that never scaled. He kept those emails because they were a record of a life that had been messy and beautiful, not because he wanted to reconstruct a past ideal. One evening, he took a call from Morganvale. Her tone was lighter than the first interview. "I have an idea," she said. "You've been through something people want to understand. There are lessons here about values and growth." "No," Terrell said simply. "Let's keep it about the work." She hesitated, then laughed softly. "You're stubbornly consistent. I admire that." He hung up and opened an email from Marcus with a short subject line. Pilot launched. The attachment contained screenshots of a demo and a modest but glowing user note from a community center. The note was not the kind of narrative the Forbes piece celebrated, but to Terrell it mattered more. People used things that worked, organizations were helped, and a small pilot meant the program might continue. He placed his hand on the napkin on the shelf, a small, silent gesture. The ring was gone. He had given it to a local recycling initiative that accepted metal for craftsmen, a symbolic release he had never displayed. He had not sought spectacle. He had sought to make room, for himself and for others. When the legal case finally moved toward resolution, no dramatic gavel, no triumphant montage, only the sober lines of negotiated settlements and pending motions, Terrell filed a short, crisp public statement, the kind he had learned to write. "We will continue to cooperate with the authorities. We will keep building with integrity. We will support those harmed." He meant each sentence in the literal way such sentences are meant, as commitments to action, not rhetorical flourishes. Months later, on a quiet Sunday, he met Dr. Alicia for coffee and a walk through a park. They talked about code, about the ethics board, and about a small exhibit Dr. Alicia was curating on technology and neighborhood life. Their relationship had grown not as a rescue from loneliness, but as a partnership grounded in shared values and mutual respect. It was slow, steady, and unremarkable in the best way. At the program's anniversary, he introduced 3 new cohorts and watched people whose names once meant nothing to venture capitalists now light up on screen with prototypes and theories. He stood in the back and listened. The work he had chosen to focus on, mentoring, policy, funding, kept unfolding in practical increments. Years after the napkin first fluttered on the table, he sometimes allowed himself a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with headlines. Someone who had once been underestimated told a story on a small podcast about how mentorship changed their trajectory. A city council member cited the mentorship fund as evidence that public-private partnerships could yield results. A student who'd received a micro-grant sent a snapshot of a product prototype and a note that said simply, "Thank you." He kept thinking with a kind of patient incredulity about how fragile reputations are and how durable small practices can be. He had been called too simple once as a barb. He had learned to be proud of a simplicity that was deliberate, one that chose to be useful and kind rather than performatively grand. He had also learned that victory without compassion leaves a taste of ash. The best outcomes, he found, were ones that combined competence with care. At a small civic forum, he closed his talk the way he had closed many things since the acquisition, with a practical request and a commitment. "If you see someone working quietly," he said, looking out at the faces in the room, "help them make that work legible. The world will reward spectacle, but it will survive on steady work." He left the stage to polite applause. Outside, the afternoon light felt plain and honest. He walked home through streets he had always known, bought a book at a small bookstore, and paused to watch a child learning to ride a bike. The child wobbled and then steadied when a neighbor ran alongside for a few strides. The neighbor's small assistance was the kind of thing the world needed more of, discreet help that made public successes possible. At night, he sometimes pulled the napkin from its place and smoothed it with both hands, a private liturgy with no audience. The headline had once suggested a clever irony, owning the bank she borrowed from, but real ownership, he knew, was what you did with influence, not a certificate. He had chosen to make influence into a kind of architecture that made more lives possible. That felt like ownership that mattered. If you'd ever been underestimated, he would tell you, it's not about proving them wrong to the world. It's about building patiently until more people can stand where you stood. If you get a moment of attention, don't let it harden you. Let it be a bridge for someone else. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and share in the comments a time you were underestimated.